They gathered close as the night pressed in. The air was sharp with the scent of rain-soaked earth and the faint sweetness of smoke. Around them the world lay in darkness, an ocean of wind and stone and distant animal cries. But here, in this small circle of light, warmth bloomed. Sparks rose like fireflies into the cave's breathless air, tracing brief constellations before fading into black. For the first time, the dark did not entirely belong to the beasts beyond. The flame crackled, uncertain at first, as though testing the right to exist. They had carried embers from a lightning-struck tree, guarding them through wind and hunger until they learned how to feed it. A dry twig, a puff of air, a secret coaxed from nature itself. When the wood caught, its glow painted their faces in gold and amber. Shadows moved across the walls, elongated, trembling, alive. They watched the shapes dance and recognized something in them, themselves. Until this moment, survival had meant motion, moving to chase, to flee, to find what little the land allowed. But fire changed motion into gathering. It drew them inward, close enough to see the shine in one another's eyes. Fear began to loosen its hold. The cold that had always divided them could now be kept at bay by shared flame. They learned, perhaps without knowing, that warmth was strongest when given. The fire became a heart around which life beat. Its rhythm set a new pattern for being: hunt by day, return by night. The flicker of flame marked the center of a fragile world. Around it they ate, spoke in gestures, touched shoulders in silent trust. The mother pressed her child to her chest and felt the heat pass between them, an invisible bond as ancient as the earth itself. Outside, predators circled, eyes gleamed at the edge of light, waiting for the moment when the fire would die. Yet the fire lived because they guarded it together. Every spark that flew upward carried the echo of a choice: to remain, to protect, to belong. Before fire, the night had been endless. There was no difference between darkness and fear, but light created distance. It allowed thought. They began to notice patterns: the hiss of wet wood, the way dry leaves burned brighter, the way warmth lingered in stone. Curiosity stirred alongside caution. The same minds that once only sensed danger now sensed possibility. In that pale, shifting glow, the first human families began to form, not from rules or bloodlines, but from necessity and affection intertwined. Each person depended on the others to keep the flame alive. One fetched branches, another shielded sparks from the wind, another tended the child who shivered. Through these small acts, they built something invisible yet enduring: kinship. The cave walls recorded their presence in shadow. Every movement, every reach for a stick, every shared glance cast silhouettes that lingered longer than memory. Perhaps they saw those outlines and wondered if the walls themselves were alive. Perhaps they began to understand reflection, that an image could be them and not them at once. Such moments planted the seeds of imagination. Food sizzled over the heat, a root, a strip of meat. The smell filled the chamber, drawing sighs of hunger and satisfaction. Taste changed with fire. Bitterness softened, scent deepened. Eating together became an act of communion. No longer did each fend alone. They waited, passed food, watched one another chew and smile. Beneath that fragile roof of smoke, they discovered a language older than words, the language of shared survival. Firelight revealed faces instead of shapes. For the first time, they could see expression, the curve of a mouth, the tightening of eyes in laughter or fear. These details became clues to feeling. They learned that pain could be seen and soothed, that joy could be mirrored. The ability to read emotion, born from light flickering across skin, would one day become empathy itself. Outside, the wind shifted. It whispered through the valley and over the plains where rivers carved paths through stone. But inside the cave, time slowed. The fire's hum became a lullaby, steady and patient. Someone began to tap a rhythm, stone against bone, heart against heart. Perhaps it was boredom. Perhaps it was the first song. Night after night, the ritual continued. Each evening, they returned to the same spot, stacking wood, coaxing flame, arranging themselves in the same circle. Habit formed memory. Memory formed story. The children grew up measuring time not by the moon, but by the glow that faded to embers and rose again. They feared the dark less, yet respected it more. Beyond the boundary of light still lay uncertainty, the rustle of predators, the glint of unseen eyes. But within that uncertainty, they found purpose. The dark no longer erased them. It defined the edge of their world. Once the world had seemed endless and indifferent. The sun came and went without witness. But now, because of fire, there was witness. They could watch the sunset and bring its echo back in miniature form, contained within their reach. To create light from darkness was to claim a piece of the universe as their own. The fire taught rhythm. It needed tending, feeding, breathing space. It demanded awareness of time. How long before wood burned out, how quickly sparks caught new fuel. In serving it, they learned patience. They learned cooperation. One blew on coals while another gathered branches. One rested while another watched the flames. Each task wove them tighter together. And perhaps as the fire crackled, they began to speak. Not with words we would recognize, but with sounds shaped by the need to share. A warning hiss, a beckoning hum, a soft call to comfort a child. In the mouth's experiment with air and meaning lay the first threads of language. Flame gave them not only warmth, but a reason to listen. From the edges of that ancient circle, imagination reached outward. Shadows flickering on the walls became creatures of story. Hunts retold, dangers conquered, dreams shaped from smoke. Around the fire, the world became narratable. They began to picture tomorrow. When storms came, they huddled closer, trusting that the fire would survive. When it rained too hard and the flames sputtered, they carried glowing coals beneath bark, sheltering them until the skies cleared. The fire's survival became their own identity. To lose it was to be cast again into the cold silence of before. Generations later, the pattern repeated wherever people wandered. Across valleys, across continents, small clusters of light appeared against the dark. Each flame was a heartbeat, each circle a promise. Beneath every first fire, the same lesson whispered through smoke. Survival was not strength alone. It was tenderness multiplied. In the shifting glow, they discovered the first sense of belonging. They learned that comfort could be made, not merely found. That the world, though vast and dangerous, could be shaped by hands joined together. When dawn came, the coals still breathed faintly. They stirred them, fed them, watched them flare again. The child who had slept nearest the warmth opened her eyes to the morning chill and reached out to touch the embers. The world was still cold, but she no longer feared it completely. They stepped outside, blinking against the new light. Mist curled from the ground. The sky blushed with the first color of day. Behind them, the cave exhaled a last wisp of smoke. The fire had survived the night, and so had they. In the quiet after dawn, a new certainty settled in their bones. They were more than wanderers now. They were keepers of flame, caretakers of one another. Each sunrise that followed carried that memory forward. Every spark struck from stone, every camp made beside glowing coals, repeated the same ancient vow: to stay, to share, to see each other through the dark. Humanity did not begin with the clash of weapons or the carving of tools. It began here, in the hush between crackle and breath, when warmth was first chosen over fear. Around that first fire, the human story took its shape, not of dominance, but of connection. And though the ages turned and empires would one day rise and fall, the meaning of that moment endured. Whenever night descended and someone lit a flame to keep it at bay, they were repeating the gesture of those earliest families. A reminder carried quietly through time. The light that saves us is not born from conquest, but from the simple decision to stay close. Even now, if one listens closely to the sound of wood burning, there is an echo of those voices, the murmur of care, the rhythm of breathing, the pulse of shared existence. The fire's song remains unchanged. It hums beneath the noise of modern life, beneath electric bulbs and distant cities, waiting to be remembered. Because the first families did not only master fire, they became part of it. Its warmth lived in their hands, its persistence in their hearts. It shaped the stories they told, the dreams they carried, the paths they chose. And when the final spark of each night drifted upward and vanished into the dark, they believed, perhaps, that it joined the stars. Tiny reminders that even in the vast cold of the universe, there could be light born of togetherness. The dawn of kinship began not with words, but with firelight upon faces, an unspoken promise shimmering on stone. They had found a way to endure, not alone, but side by side. And from that fragile circle of warmth, all of human history began to glow. The world they inherited was not yet kind. The air carried a thin metallic chill, sharp enough to sting the lungs. Across the horizon stretched a silence so vast that it seemed to swallow sound itself. Wind moved endlessly over plains of frost and stone, sculpting the land into shapes both strange and familiar. Ice crouched at the edges of mountains, patient and immovable, while rivers wound through valleys like frozen veins. The sun, pale and reluctant, offered light without warmth. Here, existence balanced on the edge of endurance. Every breath was a calculation. The cold did not simply press against the skin. It entered the body, searching for weakness. The first families learned to read its language, the way frost gathered on bark before a storm, the hollow echo of snow when it concealed thin ice, the rhythm of migrating herds whose movements marked the seasons better than any star. They were not alone in this frozen world. Across ridges and forests, others moved, heavy-browed, broad-shouldered, dressed in hides stitched with sinew. Some faces looked strangely familiar, though they belonged to a different branch of the same great tree. They shared the same fires, the same hunger, the same awe of the vast and shifting sky. Whether they met as rivals or as kin, the cold was their common ancestor. The world demanded adaptation. One day might bring clear skies and brittle sunlight. The next, a storm that buried paths and memory alike. They learned to follow the herds that roamed the steppe: mammoth, reindeer, bison. Each movement a reminder that life itself was migration. They carried everything that mattered: tools, furs, children, embers wrapped in bark to seed the next fire. Their journey was not in miles, but in generations. When night descended, they sought shelter not for comfort, but for survival. Sometimes a hollow in the rock, sometimes the curve of a fallen tree shielded them from the wind's teeth. Smoke clung to their fur and hair, marking them as creatures of both earth and flame. The smell never left them. It was the scent of safety. The landscape around them was not dead. It only appeared so. Beneath the snow, seeds slept. Beneath the ice, rivers dreamed of thaw. Even the glaciers, vast and ancient, were restless, creeping forward grain by grain, shaping valleys that would one day cradle forests. Time itself seemed slower here, measured not by days, but by the cracking of ice, the slow melting of stone beneath the sun's faint touch. Everywhere they looked, the scale of the world dwarfed them. Mountains rose like frozen waves. The sky stretched beyond thought. And yet, within that immensity, they built small circles of warmth, a shelter of branches, a cave darkened by smoke. Each became a universe unto itself. Inside, there was breathing, whispering, the quiet rhythm of shared life. Outside, infinity waited. They watched the horizon for signs of change, the faint shimmer of distant snowstorms, the movements of birds, the tracks of animals pressed into the crusted earth. The world spoke constantly, but only those who listened survived. In the whisper of wind through grass, in the creak of ice beneath the moon, they heard both warning and invitation. For every moment of beauty, there was equal danger. Ice fractured without sound, cliffs crumbled underfoot. Predators followed scent trails through the dusk. The great cats, the wolves, the silent hunters of the night. Each shadow might be death wearing fur, but fear was not the only lesson the wild offered. It also taught reverence. The first families learned that survival was not conquest, it was negotiation. They belonged to the land as much as it belonged to them. The cold sculpted not only the land, but the mind. In the endless grey of winter, they dreamed vividly. Some dreams came from hunger, others from memory. The crackling of the fire became the sound of footsteps from the past. The glitter of frost on the walls became a map of imagined places. Through dreaming, they stretched the boundaries of their small shelters into the immensity beyond. When food was scarce, they remembered other seasons, other landscapes. They had crossed green plains before, chased herds across rivers now locked in ice. They would again. The knowledge lived in their bones. The rhythm of departure and return, of scarcity and renewal. The earth was always shifting, but so were they. Sometimes they followed the tracks of those other people, the ones whose faces were familiar, yet strange. In caves where the fire had long gone cold, they found traces, a tool left behind, a line scratched into stone, a hollow where another child had slept. There was curiosity in these discoveries, but also caution. The world was wide enough for both kinds of humans, but the margin for peace was thin. Some encounters ended with gifts, others with silence and retreat. In both cases, something of each was left behind. A gesture, a glance, a fragment of understanding. The shelters they built were temporary, but they carried the idea of home wherever they went. A few branches, a circle of stones, a pit to hold embers. The design changed with every journey, but the meaning did not. To build was to declare continuity. To create shelter in a world that could erase you overnight was an act of defiance. Snow crept into every crevice, but within the shelters, warmth persisted. Children's laughter mixed with the low hum of adults preparing food. The rhythm of work, scraping hides, grinding roots, shaping flint, became the pulse of their days. The walls were thin, but the bonds inside them were strong. The first human families learned to see the world in contrasts. Warmth and cold, hunger and plenty, light and endless dark. Every comfort was sharpened by the memory of its absence. Gratitude was not an idea, it was instinct. Each breath, each piece of meat, each sunrise was a victory measured against extinction. The landscape, though merciless, offered moments of startling grace. At twilight, the ice caught the last light and shattered it into 1,000 hues. Pink, gold, violet. Herds moved like living shadows across the plains. The wind, though cruel, carried distant music. The howl of wolves, the crack of distant glaciers, the heartbeat of a living world. Their understanding of time was different from ours. They lived inside cycles, not lines. The melting of ice, the migration of herds, the return of green shoots, each was part of a pattern older than memory. They did not think of history as something behind them, but as something moving through them. And always, there was the shelter. However fragile, it was enough. When storms raged, they pressed together, listening to the world's fury battering against their walls of bone and wood. The walls might bend, but the will inside did not. When the wind finally quieted, they stepped outside to see what remained and began to rebuild. This rhythm, loss, endurance, renewal, became their inheritance. From it grew everything that would follow: community, ritual, hope. The world gave nothing freely, yet it gave meaning through struggle. In enduring it together, they discovered who they were. The smallest warmth could transform despair into faith. A spark caught on dry moss could mean the difference between life and death. A single shelter, no bigger than a shadow on the land, could become the center of the universe for those within it. Each night, as they lay under animal hides, they listened to the slow breath of others, the soft murmur of sleep, the steady rhythm of belonging. The storm outside might last for days, the cold might return, but inside that circle of shared heat, life endured. The earth could shift, the rivers could freeze, the herds could vanish, but the family remained. In the end, that was their true shelter. Not the walls of wood or stone, but the fragile constellation of trust they built between one another. A protection no storm could tear apart. And as the ages passed, glaciers advanced and retreated, forests spread and burned, mountains cracked and reformed. Yet wherever humans went, they carried that same fragile shelter within them, the memory of closeness, of hands joined against the cold. The world they inherited had been wild beyond measure, a vast and perilous wilderness where everything could be lost. But within that wilderness, they built something that would never fade. The understanding that in a dangerous, shifting world, the only lasting home was each other. They began with nothing but their hands. Hands that had learned to strike stone and kindle flame now turned to a gentler purpose, to shape, to bind, to shelter. On an open plain where the wind never ceased, they stooped low against the cold, gathering reeds, grass, and branches in careful bundles. The air smelled of frost and earth, of smoke that had long since seeped into their hair and skin. Beneath a wide, colourless sky, the first human homes began to take shape, fragile, imperfect, and full of warmth. It was never grandeur they sought. Theirs was a kind of architecture born of necessity and tenderness, not of pride. A circle of branches bent toward one another like clasped fingers. A wall of bone against the storm. Each curve, each knot, each layer of clay pressed between sticks held a quiet promise. Here, we will stay together. The plains around them stretched endlessly, their silence broken only by the low sigh of wind moving through dry grass. It was a dangerous openness, beauty edged with fear. Out there in the pale distance, predators waited. The night itself felt alive, whispering through every gust of wind. But inside the half-built hut, a single fire flickered. The shadows it cast were soft and deliberate, shifting across the woven walls as if blessing each new line drawn by human hands. They had begun to dream not just of surviving, but of belonging. The process was slow, almost ceremonial. The adults dug shallow grooves into frozen soil with sharpened sticks, placing bones, long and curved, into the ground like roots. Between them, they wove reeds, the strands rough against calloused palms. A child watched, her breath white in the cold air, her small hands mimicking the gestures in silence. To her, this act was as ancient as fire itself. A rhythm repeated, an unspoken inheritance passed from one generation to the next. The wind moaned low, carrying flakes of snow that melted on their faces. But the family worked on, their movements synchronized in quiet understanding. The making of a home was not merely a task of survival, it was an act of connection to each other, to the land, to a fragile sense of tomorrow. Inside the growing walls, the air began to change. It held warmth now, the kind that could only come from shared breath and shared purpose. Someone laughed softly as a strand of grass slipped loose, fluttering into the firelight. Another hummed a tune, barely audible, its melody old as heartbeat. And slowly, around this shared rhythm, something invisible but enduring took root. The first memory of comfort. When the storm came, it came without mercy. Snow whipped across the plains in horizontal waves, turning horizon and sky into one seamless whiteness. The family retreated into their new shelter, a dome of bone and brush, low and steady. The fire hissed as moisture dripped from the roof, the sound steady and reassuring. Outside, the world vanished. Inside, it held together. They pressed close, bodies overlapping, the smell of smoke thick and familiar. The air trembled with the sound of the wind, not outside now but above them, muted by the roof's thin layers. For the first time, they could hear their own silence. The storm had become something distant, held at bay by their creation. Hands reached for one another, the old, the young, the newly born. Every touch reaffirmed what the walls already whispered. We have made a place of our own. The hearth at the center pulsed gently, its glow casting a warm halo over sleeping faces. It was the same light that had once danced on cave walls, but now it lived within walls they had built themselves. The air was dense with the scent of smoke, bone, and damp earth, the perfume of early civilization. Somewhere near the entrance, a mother laid down the last handful of moss to seal the cold out. The act was small, almost invisible, yet in it lay the essence of human care. Each structure they built was unique, shaped by the land that held them. Some lived in hollows carved from the earth itself, their ceilings low and strong. Others raised frames of driftwood and hide near frozen rivers. And in the farthest corners of the world, where the great beasts roamed, they stacked massive bones of mammoth into rings, curved ivory ribs forming walls that gleamed pale beneath the moon. These shelters were not permanent, but they were enduring enough to hold love and memory for a season. Their homes spoke of adaptation, of the slow marriage between human imagination and the raw materials of survival. Grass became rope, mud became mortar. The human hand became a tool not just for hunting or carving, but for shaping belonging. And in shaping it, they began to understand something deeper. That safety was not the absence of danger, but the presence of one another. Outside, the world remained vast and indifferent. Herds moved across frozen valleys. Rivers shifted courses beneath layers of ice. The air carried the cries of unseen creatures in the night. But when dawn broke, fragile and grey, smoke rose in thin lines from the plains, signals of life, persistence, and quiet defiance. To wake and see that smoke was to know someone had survived the night. The children would step barefoot into the morning frost, giggling at the bite of cold before retreating back to the warmth of the hut. Their laughter, echoing faintly through the still air, was a song of triumph. Every morning survived was a victory. Every shelter that stood another day was proof that humanity's gentlest instinct, to build, to protect, to stay, was stronger than any storm. In time, these temporary shelters became something more. The pattern of their making began to shape their minds. They learned to plan, to see beyond the next hour of hunger or fear. One would gather reeds while another prepared the fire pit. The youngest would fetch dry grass. The structure itself became a map of cooperation, each task depending on another, each gesture reaffirming trust. It was in these small acts, not in weapons or conquest, that civilization began. The shared effort of building taught rhythm, patience, and foresight. It demanded that they look at one another and say, without words, I need you. Even now, buried beneath millennia of earth and silence, traces of those first homes remain. Rings of stones once used to weigh down hides, charred circles that mark ancient hearths, fragments of bone arranged too deliberately to be the work of chance. Each piece speaks in the language of intention, the human desire to create space against chaos. But perhaps the truest evidence lies not in what they left behind, but in what endured within us. The instinct to return home at the end of the day, the comfort of a closed circle of light in the darkness, the quiet relief of hearing rain from inside, knowing we are safe. These feelings, universal and wordless, are echoes of that first warmth beneath the bone huts and woven grass. When the family moved on, as they often did, they would leave their shelters behind, sometimes intact, sometimes dismantled to reuse the materials. The wind would reclaim the site, erasing footprints and smoke stains until only a faint outline remained. And yet, in memory, the place lingered. Each member carried its image in their mind. The curve of the wall, the glow of the fire, the laughter that once filled the air. It was the first concept of home as something portable, something carried not in the hands, but in the heart. As generations passed, the act of building became ritual. Before a new shelter rose, they would clear the ground carefully, smoothing the earth, removing stones. It was both preparation and reverence, a quiet acknowledgement that they were shaping a space worthy of rest. They may not have spoken of sanctity, but they practiced it instinctively. Every home, no matter how temporary, was sacred because it held life. By night, the flicker of their fires dotted the horizon like fallen stars. From a distance, the plains might have seemed empty, yet each small point of light marked a family, a story, a moment of fragile peace against an ancient wilderness. And though each fire would fade, the memory of light endured, passed from one generation to the next. That endurance was the essence of their creation. The shelters were fragile, yes, easily broken by weather or time. But the idea behind them was indestructible. The notion that one could carve out a corner of warmth in a cold and shifting world became the foundation for everything that followed. And so, through wind and ice, through hunger and fear, the small shelters stood. Their walls were thin, their fires small, but within them the human heart found its first echo of permanence. They had learned that to build was to hope, and to hope was to live. When the wind rose again, as it always did, they no longer trembled at its sound. They listened instead, from within walls of their own making, surrounded by the soft breathing of those they loved. And in that moment, fragile, flickering, and eternal, the story of home truly began. Long before the first word was spoken, there was understanding. It moved in silence, through the narrowing of eyes, the tilt of a head, the way a hand lingered in the air before falling. In the glow of the fire, gestures spoke in place of sound. The night was thick with unspoken meaning. A mother's warning glance, a hunter's brief nod, the shift of shoulders that said wait. Around that fire, where speech had not yet found its shape, language was already alive. Not in syllables, but in rhythm and breath. A woman leaned close to her child, drawing a simple line in the dirt. She did not speak, but the movement of her hand told a story. The child watched, eyes wide, understanding the message. The line was a path, and at its end, a mark for danger, a place where the shadows moved wrong. The child nodded, his breath catching for a moment in the fire's light. Then, without words, he pressed his own small hand beside the mark, mirroring his mother's intent. Agreement, understanding, connection, all bound together in a quiet exchange of gestures. The world around them was soundless in another way. The great plains stretched under the moon's pale glow, wind sighing through grass, the distant cry of unseen beasts echoing off stone. But among themselves the silence was full. The fire cracked, someone shifted. A low hum of breath passed between bodies resting close. Every flicker of light, every turn of the head carried meaning. They did not yet name things, but they already shared them. Long before vocabulary, before grammar and sound, communication existed as a dance of expression. The the soft rhythm of motion and response. When danger loomed, one glance could be enough. When joy filled them, a hum or sway of the body conveyed more than speech ever could. It was language born from the pulse of life itself, shaped not by intellect alone, but by empathy, by the ability to feel what another felt. In the half-dark of the cave, faces glowed amber beneath the firelight. The light accentuated every twitch of muscle, every widening of the eyes. Here, emotion became language. A raised brow might warn, "Do not move." A soft exhale might soothe, "You are safe." Even laughter, a sudden burst of sound, was not yet amusement, but reassurance. "I am near. You belong." Each evening, as the fire burned low, they told stories without words. A hunter would rise and mime the day's events, the chase through tall grass, the sudden fall of prey, the narrow escape. His arms cut through the air in sweeping arcs. His companions' faces glowed with understanding. Children leaned forward, entranced by the silent performance. When he finished, there was no applause, only a ripple of quiet grins, the first echoes of shared narrative. It was in those moments that meaning began to crystallize. The gestures became more deliberate, more repeatable. A flick of the hand, a tap of the chest, a wave toward the horizon. Each found its place in a growing lexicon of motion. Slowly, through repetition, silence learned to speak. But even then, their communication held a kind of music. It relied not only on motion, but on rhythm, on the tempo of breath and the cadence of pauses. A hunter's warning came sharp and short. A mother's comfort flowed long and soft. These were the first tones of speech, the scaffolding upon which words would one day hang. And beneath it all, firelight played its quiet role. The flicker of flame illuminated each gesture, magnified each expression. In the dark, the glow became both signal and stage, the earliest theatre of human connection. It was through firelight that they learned to read one another's faces, to anticipate emotion, to shape their movements for clarity. The flames taught them how to be seen, and being seen, they learned how to speak. The night outside remained vast and cold, but within the circle of light, meaning grew dense and warm. They were learning something revolutionary, that understanding could exist outside the body, passed from mind to mind through symbol and motion. This realization, though silent, would change everything. Some nights, the gestures evolved into sound, small, tentative murmurs that slipped from the throat without intention, a hum to draw attention, a hiss to warn, a soft of satisfaction, mirrored and echoed by others until it became ritual. Each sound carried emotion first, reason second. Over time, these fragments began to link, creating rhythm where before there was only noise. It was the dawn of speech, and yet it still belonged to the night, quiet, uncertain, full of mystery. There were moments when the silence felt sacred, as if the world itself was listening. The stars above burned steadily, their cold light touching the earth like a whisper. Beneath them, humanity began to murmur its first words, fragile, hesitant, but filled with purpose. Communication was never just about survival. It was about recognition. To be understood was to be seen, to be known in a world that was otherwise vast and indifferent. Each gesture was a plea and a promise. I am here. You are here. We belong together. Over countless generations, this silent language grew richer. It absorbed song and rhythm, movement and mimicry. Hands that once built, shelters now painted symbols on stone. Spirals, lines and handprints pressed in ochre and ash. These marks were not random. They were the first written echoes of thought, a way of saying, I existed. We existed. The walls of caves became silent witnesses to humanity's first attempt to externalize memory. In the red glow of firelight, someone would dip a hand in pigment and leave an imprint, a gesture older than any word, yet carrying the full weight of meaning. That mark said everything language would one day say: presence, identity, connection. Even as they began to speak in murmurs, the old language of gesture never disappeared. It lived within every nod and smile, every movement of the eyes. It became the undercurrent of speech, the emotional grammar that words alone could never replace. When the group traveled, crossing plains and forests, communication became a thread that bound them across distance. A raised arm halted the group. A low whistle turned heads. The harmony of motion and sound guided them through landscapes where survival depended on unity. In this harmony lay the roots of what would later become syntax, structure born from necessity, from the need to be understood quickly and precisely. The night before language, however, remained a kind of paradise. There was freedom in that silence, a closeness that words could sometimes later obscure. In the glow of firelight, meaning was immediate, visceral. A look could pierce deeper than speech. A gesture could hold more tenderness than any sentence. Theirs was a communion of presence, a language not yet divided by grammar or distance. And then one night, no one knew when, the first true word was spoken. Perhaps it was a name, perhaps a call, perhaps something as simple as come. It slipped out, shaped by breath and memory, and hung in the air like smoke. For a heartbeat, the world held still. The fire crackled softly. Eyes met across the light. And in that silence after sound, understanding bloomed. Complete, undeniable, profound. The word might have been lost to time, but the moment endured. It was the beginning of everything that followed. Story, music, prayer, promise. Yet, even as words multiplied, something of the old silence remained. That deep, wordless connection beneath all language. Later, when they began to gather in larger groups, when speech took on rhythm and repetition, they still returned each night to the fire. It was here that communication found its truest home. Beneath the shifting glow, they spoke softly, their voices woven with gesture and expression. The firelight continued to translate feeling into motion, motion into meaning. It was the same ancient code that had once united them in silence, now transformed into speech. Even now, tens of thousands of years later, we carry traces of that first language. We still gesture when words fail us, still seek understanding in a look, still gather by light, whether of flame or screen, to share stories and feel less alone. Beneath every conversation lies that original silence, that primal rhythm of motion and breath that once bridged the space between minds. The world has grown louder since then, but somewhere, beneath all the noise, the language of firelight still burns, quiet, tender, eternal, reminding us that before we spoke, we understood. Winter had come early that year. The wind no longer carried the smell of grass or distant rain, only the sharp, hollow scent of ice and dust. The land had withdrawn into silence. Rivers crusted over, the earth hardened and pale beneath frost. Each breath hung in the air a moment too long before vanishing, as if reluctant to leave the warmth of a body. And around a dim fire, the family huddled close, their faces drawn and still. The food had run out days ago. The bones from the last hunt, a deer found half-starved itself, were already blackened from being turned over the flames again and again, scraped clean of every fragment of marrow. The skins they wore had stiffened in the cold. The air inside the shelter smelled faintly of smoke and desperation. Hunger was a silence of its own kind. It hollowed the air, stripped the world of song. The once familiar laughter of children had quieted to small, shallow breaths. Conversation became gesture. Gesture became stillness. There was no energy to waste on sound. They had lived through hard seasons before, storms, migrations, the long distances between prey. But this was different. The cold had come too soon, the herds too few. Tracks once easy to read vanished under snow. The hunters returned each night empty-handed, eyes lowered, hands trembling from exhaustion. And yet, in the center of that stillness, a small flame persisted, fragile, defiant. The fire burned low, its light flickering across faces that refused to turn away from one another. Outside, the world glittered cruelly, beautiful and merciless. The sky was clear, strewn with stars so sharp they seemed to cut through the air. Frost crept across the entrance, tracing delicate white veins along the ground. The only movement came from the smoke rising, thin and uncertain, into the vast cold. Inside, the family made choices that no creature should have to make. A man, older than the rest, sat apart for a long time watching the fire. He had not eaten for 2 days, but when a scrap of meat, barely enough for a child's palm, was passed around, he shook his head. The piece found its way instead to the youngest, whose small hands cupped it reverently, eyes too tired to understand generosity. That moment, the quiet refusal. The offering was older than language, older than morality as we know it. It was the beginning of empathy, the choice to give what little one had so that another might survive. Across the ages, the hunger season had shaped humanity in ways deeper than bone or tool. Scarcity had forced the question that no other species seemed to ask. What do we owe one another? In the dark, as the wind howled beyond the walls, they leaned closer for warmth. Breath mingled with breath. The firelight revealed every subtle motion, a hand tightening around another's, an arm adjusting a sleeping child's position. Survival was no longer a matter of strength, but of shared endurance. The old man's eyes closed. He listened to the faint rhythm of breathing, to the small sounds of life continuing. His hunger was sharp, but beneath it ran something softer, a calm that came from seeing others still alive. Outside, wolves called to one another across the frozen distance. Their cries were long, echoing, hungry. For a moment, it was impossible to tell whether the sound came from the wild or from within. When dawn arrived, it brought no warmth, only the colorless light of a sun too far away to matter. The fire had nearly gone out, its embers pulsing faintly like a heartbeat under ash. A child coughed, thin and dry. The mother bent close, pressing her forehead against his, whispering something only he could hear. It wasn't language yet, but it was love, a sound of reassurance older than speech. The hunters prepared to leave again. Their movements were slow, mechanical, the body conserving what little energy remained. One tied a strip of hide around his wrist, a small ritual, a memory of the hunts that had once brought abundance. Another rubbed ash on his hands, perhaps to harden himself against hope. They stepped into the morning silence. The snow swallowed their footsteps almost immediately. Back inside, time became fluid, measured not in hours but in breaths, in the faint crackle of the coals, in the rise and fall of sleeping forms. The mother's eyes drifted toward the entrance each time the wind shifted, as though she could will the hunter's return. Hunger did strange things to memory. It sharpened some images, erased others. She could no longer recall the taste of sweetness, but she remembered the texture of her child's hair, the warmth of skin against skin. These became sustenance in themselves, invisible nourishment, keeping her alive long after her stomach had forgotten food. As evening fell again, footsteps returned. Slow, dragging. The men carried little. One clutched the limp body of a hare, another held a handful of roots pulled from frozen soil. It was not enough, but it was something. They cooked the meat in silence. The smell of it filled the air, rich and painful. The mother portioned it carefully, dividing even the smallest fragments with precision that bordered on reverence. Each bite was a promise that they would last one more night. But the child's fever had worsened. His breathing came shallow, his skin hot against the mother's palm. The others watched, helpless. They had no medicine, no herbs, only warmth and time. The mother dipped a scrap of hide into melted snow and pressed it to his forehead. The firelight flickered low, reflecting in her eyes. For a moment, it seemed as if the whole world had contracted to this. The small circle of light, the fragile body beside it, the heartbeat of flame. Outside, the universe was cold and vast. Inside, it was unbearably human. There was a choice to make. The hunters whispered quietly. Should they move on tomorrow, searching for a new valley where the cold might be less cruel? Or should they stay, risk the dwindling food, to keep the child near the fire? No one spoke loudly. Decisions made in hunger were sacred, weighted. The leader, not by strength but by patience, looked from one face to another. The snow outside shifted against the walls, a sound like breath. At last, he nodded. They would stay. No one questioned it. The choice meant more hunger, more uncertainty, but it also meant something else. That survival was not merely endurance, but care. That to protect one another, even when it endangered oneself, was the deepest form of strength. The night grew colder. The fire burned lower. The mother whispered softly into her child's ear, stories without words, sounds that carried the rhythm of heartbeats and rivers. He stirred once, his eyes fluttering open. She smiled through tears that froze before they fell. In that small act, the choosing to stay, to wait, the roots of morality deepened. Compassion was no longer instinct alone. It had become conviction. Long after, when they finally moved on, the child survived. The thaw came slowly, a hesitant kindness from the sky. Snow softened into streams. The earth began to breathe again. Birds returned, their calls thin but insistent. The first green shoots broke through the grey soil, fragile and miraculous. The family gathered what remained of their belongings, now lighter than before. The mother carried her child, thinner but awake, wrapped in the last of their furs. As they stepped out into the melting light, their faces turned upward. For the first time in months, the sun felt like something they could touch. Behind them, the place they had endured through winter remained. A ring of stones around a dead fire, a few bones scattered, a faint impression of where bodies had slept close together. It was not much, but it was enough to tell a story. Here, hunger came, and here, love endured it. They walked on, following the faint scent of life in the air. The land stretched open again, its harshness softened by spring. Each step forward was an act of faith, in each other, in the possibility of tomorrow. The hunger season would return, as it always did, but so would the warmth, and between them, humanity learned its first moral truth, that the measure of survival was not who ate the most, but who shared when there was least to give. Even now, when famine strikes or hardship spreads, something ancient stirs in us, that quiet inheritance of compassion, born from cold nights and empty fires. We still reach for one another, still divide what little we have, still choose to stay when it would be easier to run. For long ago, in a winter that nearly broke the world, we learned that the only true refuge from hunger is the human heart itself. Night had fallen again. The fire whispered its low music, a thread of light weaving through the dark like something alive. Smoke drifted upward, curling around the damp stone roof, and the family drew closer, their bodies making a small circle against the vast, indifferent cold beyond the cave's mouth. The flames had burned low, but their rhythm remained, a pulse, steady as breath, marking the quiet hours between the last hunt and the first frost of dawn. The oldest among them sat nearest the glow. His face was creased by wind and years, his eyes reflecting the slow dance of embers. The children leaned in close, the warmth touching their cheeks, their gazes fixed on his hands as he began to move them through the air. Not in work this time, but in memory. His fingers drew shapes, of rivers once flowing, of beasts once hunted, of skies long ago clouded with smoke and fire. No words passed between them, yet everyone understood. The gestures carried weight, a familiarity beyond language. They had no names for years or ages, but they knew what it meant when the old man spoke of the valley before the great ice came. They knew what it meant when he pointed toward the stars, tracing the path of ancestors who had followed the herds north or the rivers south, searching for a kinder land. His stories were not told to entertain. They were maps, warnings, and songs of gratitude. Each tale held the shape of survival, where water could be found, which plants would heal, which caves echoed the voices of spirits. And though his voice, when it finally came, was little more than a rasp, it carried through the silence like a heartbeat remembered. The children listened not only with their ears, but with the stillness of their bodies, feeling every pause and breath. They did not ask why these stories mattered. The fire itself seemed to answer. It flickered when a name was spoken, glowed brighter at moments of triumph, dimmed at tales of loss. For as long as the flames endured, so too did memory. When people spoke of survival, they often thought of tools or fire, of the body enduring against the cold. But in truth, it was memory that kept them alive. Before the written word, before even the shaping of symbols, stories formed a bridge across time. Through them, a life could stretch beyond its years, a voice could outlast its breath. Around each hearth, the human mind began to weave patterns of continuity, a way to make sense of change, a rhythm to hold back chaos. They learned that a tale repeated was a kind of shelter. It gave shape to fear, softened grief, and turned disaster into instruction. When the rains failed one year, the elders spoke of another time when the same had happened, how their ancestors had followed the migrating herds and returned with fire still burning. When lightning struck a distant hill, they recalled the first time the sky had opened like that, and how the mountain had taught them respect. Each story transformed uncertainty into meaning, and in doing so, turned memory into a tool as vital as any spear or stone blade. The elders might not have understood the strange alchemy happening within their listeners, the quiet surge of calm, the spark of connection that followed a well-told story. But something in them sensed its power. The mind, soothed by rhythm, opened itself to pattern and imagination. The children's eyes would grow heavy, not because the stories were dull, but because they were safe. The steady voice of an elder was a promise. You belong to a people who remember. Sometimes the stories came in fragments, a name murmured during a storm, a gesture mimicking the swoop of a bird. Other nights they unfolded in full, long arcs that stretched from creation to now. The voices of storytellers across generations merged into something larger, something that seemed to hum through the very air. They spoke of animals that once ruled the plains, of spirits who guarded rivers, of the first woman who found fire sleeping beneath stone. Each listener added a thread of their own. A daughter would recall a scent, wet earth before rain, and one day when she spoke, that scent would find its way into her tale. A son would remember the cry of a dying beast and give it meaning, that even in death, life continued elsewhere. Slowly, almost without realizing, they built a web of collective remembrance, an oral landscape as intricate as any carved monument. The world they inhabited was fragile, and yet within that fragility lay a strange endurance. Words, though they vanished into air, carried further than stone. They could cross generations without ever being written, moving like wind through tall grass, reshaping themselves, but never truly lost. And so memory became their inheritance. If one had watched from afar, from the dark edge of the valley, they might have seen nothing but a faint shimmer against the cold horizon, a glow trembling through fog. Yet within that glow lived the oldest form of art, storytelling as ritual, as science, as faith. The rhythm of those fireside nights echoed something deep within the human brain. The mind was drawn to repetition, to cadence. It recognized the comfort of pattern the way it recognized the pulse of the heart or the rise and fall of breath. A story, told in rhythm, eased the nervous system, soothed fear, and invited rest. Long before songs were sung, this was the music of speech. The deliberate pace, the gentle emphasis, the pauses that made meaning breathe. They told not only what had happened, but how it felt. The pain of hunger, the relief of thaw, the tenderness of holding a newborn for the first time. Memory was not a record of events. It was the emotional architecture of belonging. And in that space between the known and the forgotten, storytelling became sacred. There were nights when the sky cleared and the stars hung close as though listening. Then, the elders would turn their faces upward, tracing constellations not for beauty, but for guidance. They spoke of the bright wanderers that moved differently from the others, how one star marked the time to follow the herds, another the return of spring. But even these lessons became wrapped in story. The hunter who chased the beast across the heavens, the mother who lit the night so her children would not fear the dark. By binding truth to imagination, they ensured it would endure. The story made the knowledge memorable. The emotion made it unforgettable. What began as simple memory evolved into culture, a shared vision of the world and their place within it. Every hearth, every cave, every circle of smoke-stained stones became a kind of library. There were no books, but each storyteller carried thousands of pages in the form of breath and rhythm. A life could end, but the story it carried would ripple outward, taken up by another, reshaped and respoken, until even the original teller's name was gone. What remained was the pattern and the feeling. In that way, storytelling defied time. The people themselves came and went, but their memories remained woven into the night's quiet hum. It was said, though no one could say who first said it, that when the fire crackled just so, the ancestors were speaking through the flames. The young ones would listen for that sound, the sharp pop of resin, the sigh of embers collapsing, and imagine the old voices whispering through. Perhaps that was the earliest form of prayer, to sit in silence and remember. There were no temples, no carved idols. Their gods were the moments themselves, the thunder that rolled after lightning, the first warmth after the long winter, the story that returned each year unchanged. In those patterns they saw something immortal. When morning came, the family would rise, brush the ashes from their furs, and step into the cold again. The hunt, the hunger, the long walk towards some distant valley, all would resume, but something unseen followed them. The residue of words, the invisible thread connecting them to every story told before. Even the youngest carried echoes. They might hum the rhythm of a tale without remembering its meaning, or trace a symbol in the dust that resembled a figure once drawn on a cave wall. Through them, memory continued its quiet migration, from one body to another, from one age to the next. Long after the fire had died, the story remained. It lived in the cadence of footsteps across snow, in the way hands moved together when building a shelter, in the way a mother's tone softened when calling her child's name. Memory was not confined to the mind. It was written into movement, into habit, into the shared pulse of a people who refused to forget. And so, beneath the vast silence of an unrecorded world, the first families carried something indestructible. They did not know that one day others would name it storytelling, or that it would give rise to poems, to history, to all the words that would one day fill entire worlds. To them, it was simply what life required. The fire they fed when all else grew dark. It was the one inheritance no storm could wash away. In the quiet, after the last voice faded, the family lay close together. The fire had burned to embers now, their glow barely visible against the ash. Outside, the wind moved like a tide through the valley, cold and eternal. Inside, memory held them, small, fragile, but unbroken. The old man closed his eyes. The children, still half awake, felt the warmth of his shoulder against theirs. The night, too, seemed to listen, and if one could have stood there, unseen in the dark, they might have heard it. Not words, but the echo of something older. The first story, still speaking, still alive beneath the ashes of time. The air was still when they began, the kind of stillness that came only after a storm, when the earth was damp and every sound felt distant, as if the world itself were holding its breath. A thin mist clung to the valley, softening the outlines of stone and grass. The family moved slowly through it, carrying the small bundle wrapped in furs. No one spoke. The only sound was the crunch of soil beneath bare feet and the faint whisper of wind moving through the trees above. They stopped beside a hollow in the rock, where the morning light fell weakly, streaked with gold. It was not the first time they had come here. The ground bore traces of older grief. A shallow depression filled with faded ochre. The scattered bones of animals left as offerings long forgotten. The place had a scent of earth and smoke, a quiet that felt sacred though no one had yet named it so. The mother knelt first. Her hands trembled as she drew back the fur, revealing the child's face, pale, still, and strangely peaceful. The others gathered around, their shadows merging in the low light, their silence deepening. The old man, the same one who had once told stories by the fire, began to hum. It was not a song in the way we understand it, but a tone shaped by breath, heavy with sorrow. One by one, the others joined, their voices low and uneven, rising and falling like wind through reeds. They did not know what it meant to pray, but they knew what it meant to love and to lose. They had seen death before, in animals, in the wilderness, in strangers left unburied along the migration paths. But this was different. This was one of their own. The child's absence felt like a hollow space within the circle of their lives, an emptiness they could neither fill nor name. So they did what their hearts told them. They made meaning. They cleared a space, shaping it with careful hands. They gathered small stones, smooth and cold, placing them in a circle around the body. The mother brushed the soil away from the child's face with her fingers. She took from her neck a string of shells, worn soft from years of wear, and laid it across the chest. Then someone brought the red earth from a nearby ridge. They ground it between stones until it became dust, and sprinkled it over the child's skin until it glowed faintly in the light. Red was the color of blood, of fire, of life itself. To cover the dead in red was not to hide them, but to keep them within the living world a little longer. Perhaps they believed the color would guide the spirit, or perhaps it was simply what felt right, an instinct older than words. When they were done, they stepped back and waited. The air shifted, the mist thinned, revealing a strip of pale blue sky. And in that moment, the mother placed her hand upon the small mound of earth, fingers splayed as though to hold the world still. The hum quieted. The silence that followed was deep enough to feel sacred. They left not because they wanted to, but because they had to. The cold would return soon, the herd would move and hunger would follow. But when they turned away, each carried something unseen. A memory that would return whenever the wind moved through that valley again. Across the ages, the earth kept their secret. Long after their fires went out, others would come. Wanderers, diggers, those who sought to know what had come before. They would find the ochre, still red against the soil, and the tiny bones resting where careful hands had left them. They would see the arrangement of shells, the curved placement of arms, the deliberate piece of it all, and understand that this was not mere disposal. It was love given form. What separated this act from the carcass left to rot, or the bones scattered by wolves, was intention. They had taken time, in a world where time meant survival, to tend to the dead. That act alone spoke of something new, rising in the human heart. Compassion that reached beyond utility, care that extended beyond the living moment. In that sense, the first burial was also the first story of the soul. It is easy to imagine them as primitive, beings of instinct and hunger. But the earth tells otherwise. Burials marked with care appear across distant lands and millennia. Small graves filled with ochre, antler, ivory beads, the bones of men and women, laid beside one another as if in eternal conversation. The gestures repeated across continents suggest not imitation, but recognition. Each group, in its own way, discovered that grief demanded ritual. The living could not follow the dead, but they could trace a path to them through gesture and memory. To place a body carefully in the ground was to say, "You mattered." To leave a tool or a bead beside it was to whisper, "You will not go alone." In these quiet acts, something revolutionary stirred, the awareness that life was more than the body. That love did not end where breath did. Night would fall again, and with it, the stars. The family gathered near their fire, smaller now, their circle incomplete. They ate little, they spoke less, but when the mother lifted her eyes to the sky, she noticed something she had never seen before. A pattern among the stars, faint but clear. 3 small lights close together, one slightly apart, like a hand reaching outward. The others followed her gaze. They did not name it, yet they all felt the same ache, the sense that somewhere, somehow, the one they had buried still lingered. Perhaps that was how it began, the connection between earth and sky, between death and meaning. They saw in the heavens a reflection of their loss and began to imagine continuance. The stars became more than light, they became presence. Over time, the act of burial became ritual. Each movement, the digging, the placement, the offering, gained rhythm. The same hum the old man had sung returned, shaped by generations until it became chant. The same red dust appeared in other valleys, other ages. The gestures became memory, memory became tradition, and tradition became the first hint of faith. Not faith as doctrine or gods, but faith in connection. That the bonds of the living stretched into the silence of death. They did not yet speak of heaven or soul. But in the quiet curve of a mother's hand resting on the grave of her child, the idea was already there, that love was stronger than finality, that tenderness could cross even the boundary of breath. In later times, as new families came and went, they too buried their dead. Some laid them beneath sleeping places, as if to keep them near. Others built small stone rings around their graves. A few scattered flowers, their colours bright against the soil. The meanings changed, but the feeling remained the same. Every burial said, "We remember," and that remembering shaped them. It taught patience, reverence, and empathy. The seeds of everything that would one day be called civilization. To care for the dead required one to pause, to feel, to imagine what could not be seen. It required a mind capable of grief, and therefore of love. Much later, when the wind swept across those old valleys and the stars turned unseen by living eyes, the bones remained. They carried the story not in words, but in posture. The curve of an arm, the pattern of ochre, the orientation towards sunrise. They told us that the first families did not merely survive, they felt. They loved deeply enough to bury their dead, and in that act, that quiet folding of earth over flesh, they began to shape something greater than themselves. They created continuity. The living learned to stay not only for each other, but for those who could no longer stay. Each burial site became a landmark of memory, a way of saying we were here, we loved, we endured. When the night grew cold, they would return to that place sometimes. The firelight would flicker across the stones, and they would sit without words. The child's name, if it had ever been spoken, would not be uttered again, for names carried power. But the memory lived in the gestures. The way the mother still touched her beads before sleep. The way the father paused before crossing the stream near the valley's edge. Even silence became a kind of language, one that spoke of what could not be explained. Above them, the stars burned patiently, unblinking. Some nights, the wind would sweep through the grass and make it seem as though the earth itself were breathing. And in that sound, in that gentle motion, they felt less alone. They believed, or perhaps only hoped, that the one they had buried heard it too. The valley would outlast them all. The stones would crumble, the soil shift, the ochre fade. Yet the pattern, the impulse to honor, to remember, would remain, passed down through unseen generations. Love had taken shape in the simplest of acts, a grave, a song, a silence beneath the stars. It was there that humanity first learned to look beyond itself, to sense that every ending might also be a beginning. And so, under the ancient sky in that moment of mourning, they did not only bury their dead, they buried the fear of meaninglessness. What rose in its place was something vast, tender and enduring, the first spark of the human soul. The snow had melted at last. Beneath the long grass, the ground steamed with warmth as the sun rose higher each day. Water ran thick from the mountains, filling the rivers that curved like silver across the plains. It was the season of gathering, the time when families who had once wandered alone began to find one another again. They came from the valleys, from the cliffs where caves looked out over the ice, from the forests where the trees still remembered the last storm. At first, they were cautious, each group keeping to its own circle, their fires spaced wide apart. But the smell of roasting meat carried on the wind. The sound of laughter echoed through the dusk, and one by one, they drew closer. It began with sharing. A piece of meat passed between strangers, a child toddling toward another camp and being gently returned, a woman pointing to the sky, tracing the flight of birds, and others turning to see. From these simple exchanges, something extraordinary took root, not of invention, but of realization. They discovered that they were not alone. For thousands of years, survival had meant the family, the mother, the father, the children huddled together through winter. Every other face was potential danger. Yet the changing world demanded something more. The climate shifted. The herds moved in patterns no one family could follow alone. The predators grew bolder and the nights longer, and so they began to depend on one another in new ways. A single fire became 2, then 10. Circles of smoke rose into the same sky, each drifting toward the other, as if drawn by instinct. They began to share tools. A stone blade passed between hunters, a woven basket exchanged for dried fruit. Soon, cooperation was no longer an accident. It was a strategy. The old rhythms of solitude softened. A man could fall ill and still be fed. A woman could give birth and not fear the absence of hands to help. The children played together, watched by many eyes, learning that safety could come from belonging. It was quiet, almost invisible, this revolution, but it changed everything. The rivers became gathering places. Along their banks, smoke rose from cooking fires and laughter echoed through the reeds. Hands that once worked alone now moved in rhythm, scraping hides, shaping clay, cracking seeds. The men hunted farther, bringing back carcasses too heavy for one group to carry. The women tended fires that burned all night, guiding wanderers home. There was no plan, no counsel, no words to name what they had become. Yet the structure was already there, a web of kinship that reached beyond blood. One mother's child could be held by another's arms. One father's hunt could feed many. Each act of giving wove another thread into the fabric of belonging. It was not the loud triumph of conquest or invention that defined humanity. It was this, the quiet, daily miracle of cooperation. The nights grew warmer. Under the moonlight, they gathered to eat, to mend, to rest. The firelight reflected in their eyes as they watched one another. Not with suspicion now, but with recognition. They saw the same scars, the same lines of endurance carved by hunger and weather. They shared stories of loss and luck, of the beasts that had escaped, and the storms that had passed. From such gatherings emerged something fragile and enduring. Trust. Trust was not born overnight. It flickered at first, like flame in the wind. There were still arguments, over food, over hunting grounds, over the place of the fire. But beneath those moments of tension ran a deeper current. Understanding that together they could face what alone would destroy them. Even silence changed meaning. Once, it had been the silence of isolation, of long winters endured without voice or touch. Now, it was the silence of contentment, of shared breath, shared presence, the knowledge that someone else watched the darkness with you. Over time, these gatherings shaped the body as much as the spirit. The tasks of living began to divide. not by dominance, but by necessity. Some were quicker with their hands, weaving fibers into ropes or nets. Others had patience for grinding grain or watching children. Some learned to read the movement of clouds, others to track the moods of animals. The earliest balance of roles was not rigid but responsive, born of empathy rather than rule. A mother who carried a child might spend her strength gathering fruit near the camp, while another, older or freer, might take her place on the hunt. The men too learned to share burdens, one teaching the young to shape stone, another tending the fires while wounds healed. In this division of labor lay the first outline of society, a rhythm that made time predictable, life sustainable, and care continuous. And with it came something rarer still: joy. It was a quiet joy, expressed not in laughter alone but in gesture, a shared glance over a meal, the sound of someone humming while weaving reeds, the warmth of many bodies sleeping close, not from fear but from choice. Around the fires, children learned by imitation, by touch. A father showed his son how to strike sparks from flint. A mother guided her daughter's hand as she tied knots in sinew. In those small lessons, knowledge began to flow like water through the generations. Every gesture carried memory. Every action reinforced connection. To teach was to care, and to care was to belong. When food was scarce, the strongest often ate last. When danger approached, the old stood between the young and the wild. In those choices, cooperation ceased to be strategy and became instinct, a reflection of something deeply human. They had no word for love as we understand it, but it was everywhere. In the way one hand steadied another, in the way a mother reached for a crying child not her own. The boundaries between families blurred until the community itself became one great family. Each person was a thread, and together they formed a tapestry of survival. The hunters who brought back food depended on the fires kept by those who stayed behind. The gatherers relied on the stories told by elders, the songs that marked which routes to eat and which to avoid. It was not hierarchy that held them together, but harmony, the subtle balance between giving and receiving, leading and following. From the outside, it might have seemed simple, a cluster of people beside a river, smoke rising, laughter drifting through dusk. But within that simplicity lay the blueprint of everything that would come after. The first villages, the first tribes, the first shared vision of human life. They began to stay longer in one place, marking the ground with the patterns of their days. The fires left rings of ash that told stories of seasons. Footpaths formed between shelters, worn smooth by countless steps. Over time, the earth itself seemed to remember them, to hold the shape of their lives. The world no longer felt vast and empty. It felt inhabited, humanized, made gentle by presence. One evening, after the hunt, they gathered by the river. The air smelled of smoke and fish and wet grass. The water caught the last light of day, turning it to molten gold. Children splashed at the edges while the adults cleaned tools, their laughter carrying across the water. An old woman, her hair silver in the firelight, began to hum the same low tune once used in mourning. But now it sounded different. The melody, born of grief, had softened into something like gratitude. The others joined in, their voices weaving through the sound of the river until it was impossible to tell where song ended and nature began. It was not ceremony, yet it felt sacred. They were singing not to gods, but to each other, to the fragile, enduring network that had formed among them, to the miracle of waking each morning and finding others still there. When night came, they sat beneath the stars, just as their ancestors had. But this time, the sky did not seem so distant. The stars felt like reflections, not of gods, but of lives bound together, each light small and bright, burning in relation to the others. They looked upward and saw a pattern, not imposed by imagination, but felt by instinct, that the universe itself thrived on connection. Nothing existed in isolation. Every spark depended on another. Perhaps that was the first philosophy, unspoken yet understood, that the strength of one came from the many. By the time the next winter returned, their fires burned brighter, their shelter stood closer. The lines between survival and belonging had blurred completely. There was still hardship, still loss, but it was no longer faced alone. They had built something invisible yet enduring, a web of care that held against the storms, against hunger, against fear. and when they gathered by the fire at night, the oldest among them would look at the faces glowing in the light. The mothers, the fathers, the children, the friends, and feel something vast and new, not pride, but peace. The quiet revolution had already taken place, and it had begun not with conquest or discovery, but with the simplest of truths, that life shared was stronger than life alone. The world had grown quieter by then, the storms had softened, the herds had found new grazing lands, and the people, those quiet revolutionaries of kinship, had begun to look inward. Until then, survival had been everything. Fire, hunger, warmth, shelter, the shared breath of endurance. But now, as the rhythm of life steadied, another kind of hunger stirred. One not of the body, but of the mind. It began in silence, a pause between tasks, when someone sat by the river and saw their own reflection rippling in the water. The face that looked back was familiar and strange, both self and not self. In that shimmer of light, they glimpsed a truth they could not yet name. That they were, that realization, that a mind could recognize itself, changed the course of everything that followed. They began to mark the world. At first, it was practical, a scratch on stone to count the days between hunts, a carved stick to remember which way the herds had gone. But soon, the marks changed. They no longer pointed outward, but inward. Someone drew a line not to measure, but to remember. A curve that pleased the eye, a pattern that held no purpose except that it felt right. Meaning began to bloom in the emptiness. Hands left their prints on the walls of caves. Red ochre smeared against limestone, fingers splayed like small suns. In those prints, time dissolved. They were not messages, not warnings. They were declarations of presence. I was here. In that gesture, humanity crossed a threshold no tool could measure. At Blombos Cave, long before the painted walls of Europe, someone etched a series of diagonal lines into a piece of ochre. 6 faint strokes, deliberate, rhythmic. The marks served no clear function. They were not numbers, not directions. They were something else, an early echo of awareness. The maker did not seek to survive, but to express. It is a strange and sacred thing that the first art was born not of abundance, but of reflection. These early humans still faced hunger, cold, and death. Yet even in those conditions, they reached beyond necessity, toward meaning. They began to adorn themselves. Shells strung on sinew, beads carved from bone, red pigment smeared across the skin. To decorate was to define. To define was to understand. When they painted their bodies, they were not disguising who they were. They were revealing it. The cave walls became mirrors, not of glass, but of time. At Lascaux, in the soft light of flickering lamps, bison and horses ran across stone. The painters followed their movements with patient hands, each stroke guided by memory and reverence. The walls breathed. Shadows moved like spirits across the contours of the rock. No one knows if those images were prayers or stories. Perhaps both, perhaps neither. Perhaps they were attempts to hold still the beauty of a fleeting world. The animal already gone, the season already past, the heartbeat already faded. In those painted chambers, humanity learned to speak with silence. And somewhere in that silence, they began to see themselves reflected, not as hunters, not as survivors, but as participants in something vast and mysterious. When they gazed into still water, they saw not only a face, but a story. The reflection rippled and broke with every breath. The eyes that stared back were filled with memory, of hunger endured, of fire kept alive, of the first laughter shared beside the river. They did not know the word human, yet they felt its weight, the awareness of being both part of nature and apart from it. That duality became their mirror, to belong and to observe, to exist and to wonder. It was both a gift and a burden. As the years passed, the marks deepened. Children learned to trace them with their fingers, copying the curves of animals, the shapes of hands. In those gestures, knowledge was passed not through speech, but through rhythm. They were learning what it meant to remember. The walls became memory itself, a living archive of imagination, every new painting layered upon the old, each handprint echoing another, until the cave was not simply a place, but a mind, a collective consciousness inscribed in stone. And when the fires flickered low, the figures on the walls seemed to move. The painted deer leapt in rhythm with the flames. The bison stamped and turned their heads as if alive again. The artists must have watched this and felt a trembling recognition. That creation, even imitation, was a kind of life. To create a symbol was to break the boundary between world and mind. The ochre marks at Blombos, the handprints at Chauvet, the painted horses of Lascaux, each was a step toward the same realization, that what lived within could be carried outward. And with that power came the first shadows of identity. If one could imagine a thing, one could imagine oneself. They began to see themselves in what they made. The curve of a horn like the arc of a spine, the gesture of a running animal mirroring their own movement. The world became a reflection, a great mirror in which they sought understanding. The animals they painted were not trophies, but kin, the wild spirits that gave them food, clothing, rhythm, meaning. In painting them, they honored them. In honoring them, they honored themselves. Somewhere in those same ages, deep in the heart of Africa, a mother strung beads from shells found along the coast. The distance between sea and camp was great, too far for the shells to arrive by chance. They had been carried by hand, exchanged through generations, their whiteness gleaming like moonlight on skin. When she fastened them around her child's neck, it was not for beauty alone. It was protection, identity, belonging. It said, you are part of something larger. You come from a line that remembers. In that gesture, simple, intimate, the idea of legacy was born. They began to tell stories, too, not of how to hunt or where to find water, but of who they were. A father pointed to the stars and said they were the eyes of those who came before. A mother drew circles in the dust and told her children that everything returns. The rains, the herds, the souls. Through those stories, the first myths took shape. Mirrors of the human heart projected onto the sky. They gave meaning to loss. They gave shape to wonder, and in doing so, they gave themselves continuity. For the first time, they imagined death, not as an ending, but as a transformation. Graves became more deliberate. Bodies were laid with care, surrounded by red ochre, tools, beads, and flowers. It was an act of love and of recognition. They were not burying bodies. They were honoring lives. To do so meant they understood that life could be remembered, that memory itself was a way of keeping the world alive. That insight, more than any tool or fire, made them human. Today, when we look into mirrors, we inherit their gaze. The glass may be clearer, the reflection sharper, but the question remains the same. Who am I? When we decorate ourselves, when we write, when we take photographs or build monuments, we are repeating their gestures. We are painting our walls with new pigments, pixels, ink, sound. Each act of creation is an echo of that first self-awareness. The moment a human hand pressed against cold stone and left behind not just a mark, but a declaration of existence, we still reach for reflection, in art, in others, in the eyes of those we love. We still long to see ourselves mirrored in the world, to know that our presence means something. And when we cannot find it, we create it anew. Perhaps the greatest miracle was not that they made art, but that they recognized themselves in it. They looked upon a painted animal and felt both awe and kinship. They saw in the curve of a line the memory of motion, the shadow of thought. To see oneself in another form, that is empathy. To see the world as part of oneself, that is consciousness. Both were born in those dim caves, where breath and pigment mingled, and the human story began to unfold not in words, but in wonder. The mirror of the world has never ceased reflecting. From the water's surface to the stone walls, from bone carvings to digital screens, the same current runs beneath. The desire to know, to belong, to endure beyond one lifetime. We are, in essence, still painting in the dark, still reaching out with color and sound to affirm that we are here, that we have seen and been seen, and somewhere, deep within the quiet of that first mind that once saw its reflection shimmer in the river, the same thought still echoes. This is me. The night returns as it always does. Once more, we find ourselves before a fire, not the ancient blaze of wood and smoke, but its descendant, a quiet, steady light that hums behind glass, that flickers in our rooms, that glows in our hands. Yet even now, though millennia have passed, the warmth feels the same. It reaches through distance and time, as if carried by invisible threads of memory. The same warmth that once drew a small family together beneath a cold and endless sky. That first fire has long gone out, its ashes scattered into the soil of forgotten valleys. But its light never truly vanished. It moved from one hearth to another, from one generation to the next, crossing continents and oceans until it found its way here, into us. We are its keepers now. Imagine, for a moment, that first circle of light. The night was vast then, a wilderness of wind and silence. Around the fire, a few figures sat close, the glow brushing their faces with gold. Sparks rose into the dark like small prayers. They did not know what the world would become. They only knew the fragility of the flame, how easily it could vanish if the wind turned, or if the wood ran out. So they tended it carefully, feeding it with patience and breath. Every ember mattered. They could not have known that this simple act, staying together, guarding warmth against the dark, would become the quiet origin of everything that followed. Now, we live in cities so bright that the stars are hidden. We have light at the touch of a switch, warmth without effort, connection that spans the world. And yet, in the stillness of night, many of us feel the same old ache, a loneliness that no brightness can chase away. Perhaps it is the echo of those first nights, when the darkness beyond the fire was filled with mystery and fear. Perhaps it is memory itself, not of events, but of feeling. We remember, deep within, what it meant to gather close, to listen to one another breathe, to watch a flame and know we were not alone. In every electric glow, in every screen, in every candle lit against the silence, there is that ancient longing, to be seen, to be safe, to belong. The technology has changed, the need has not. Genetic threads still bind us to them. In every cell, in the spirals of our DNA, their choices live on. The courage to stay, the instinct to share, the tenderness that made survival possible. We carry not just their blood, but their memory, written into the body like a quiet hymn. When we reach out for comfort, when we tell stories before sleep, when we teach our children how to be kind, we are repeating lessons learned around that first fire. We inherited their fear, yes, but also their grace. Their endurance became our existence. Their small acts of care became the blueprint of what it means to be human. Across time, the fire spread. It moved from one valley to another, crossing the ages like a slow, glowing heartbeat. Some fires were built on tundra, some by rivers, some deep within the earth. Around each one, people gathered to eat, to talk, to dream. Each flame burned differently, but together they formed a chain of light that never broke. Even when entire worlds changed, when the ice melted, when empires rose and fell, the chain held. And now, as satellites circle the planet and cities shimmer with light, we stand at the farthest reach of that same lineage. Our fires are smaller now, often invisible, in the gentle pulse of a power grid, in the warmth of a home, in the quiet glow of a lamp on a bedside table. But their meaning remains. Every light we kindle is a declaration. We are still here. Think of what they must have felt when the cold came, when the wind howled through the cracks, when hunger pressed against their ribs. They could have scattered, given up, turned away from one another, but they didn't. They stayed close. That choice, to remain, to endure together, changed the story of the world. It is a small miracle, easily overlooked, that so much of human history depends not on strength, but on tenderness, the willingness to share warmth, to protect the fragile, to keep watch through the night. That was their true invention. It was not fire alone that saved them, it was each other. In that sense, the flame was never just heat or light, it was a language. The first families spoke it long before words were formed. The fire said what they could not: I am here, you are safe, we belong. When the sparks rose, they carried their unspoken dreams upward, of food, of peace, of a tomorrow worth waking for. And as they drifted into the dark, they joined the stars, those other fires, distant and eternal. Even now, when we look upward and feel a strange comfort, perhaps it is because we recognize something of ourselves there, the same glow, the same persistence. Modern science tells us what they never could have known. that every human alive descends from those who refuse to let the fire die. Their endurance shaped our genes, their compassion shaped our societies, their curiosity shaped our minds. But there are truths older than science, felt rather than proven. When we hold a child, when we build a home, when we tell a story, we are not inventing anything new. We are remembering. We are the continuation of a promise whispered long ago, that life would go on, and that love would make it possible. Perhaps that is why the rhythm of a heartbeat still calms us, why the sound of a crackling fire feels like home, even if we have never known a night without walls. Something in us still listens for that sound, the soft hiss of burning wood, the shifting breath of flame. It reminds us of who we were and who we remain. When the day's noise fades and the world grows quiet, that memory stirs beneath the surface. We find ourselves longing not for grandeur, but for closeness, for the comfort of a small circle of light in the dark. We do not need to see their faces to know them. We recognize them in our own reflections. Their shadows move within ours. Their fire burns within our hearts. And maybe, in some sense, they are still with us, not as spirits or stories, but as presence. Every time we light a candle or sit beside a campfire, or look at the stars and feel small yet safe, we are reaching across time, touching the same thread they once held. The smoke may rise differently now, but it drifts toward the same sky. The wind still carries it over mountains, across oceans, through ages, and somewhere, in that great expanse of memory, their light answers back. Close your eyes for a moment. Imagine the dark of that first night. Vast, cold, filled with unseen things. The fire crackles softly. Someone shifts beside you. The warmth touches your skin. You hear breath and the rustle of fur, and the low rhythm of a story being told in a voice you cannot quite understand. Yet it feels familiar. You look up, and through the rising smoke, you see stars. They have been watching since the beginning. They have seen every fire, every hand that tended it, every heart that dared to hope. They shine not in remembrance of what has passed, but in celebration of what continues. The first family is gone now. The cave is silent, the ashes long scattered, but the light remains. It burns in our cities, in our homes, in the quiet warmth between people who still choose to stay close when the world feels cold. It burns in laughter, in kindness, in the stories we whisper before sleep. It burns in the fragile yet enduring belief that we are not alone. And if you listen closely, beyond the hum of wires, beyond the silence of distance, you might hear it, the faint crackle of an ancient flame, still alive in the heart of the human world. So now, as the night deepens and your eyes grow heavy, remember this. The fire that began at the edge of the Ice Age has never gone out. It glows in every moment of compassion, in every act of care, in every light that keeps the darkness at bay. The world has changed beyond recognition, but the warmth remains the same. Close your eyes. The stars are still watching. The wind still moves through the trees. And the fire, the one that began it all, still burns, somewhere beyond time.